Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Firas. I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Today, News in Focus, it's recorded from our Cape Town studio, and for the next 1 hour, I'm honored to have a guest that has served as a South African ambassador to various countries across the Middle East. I'd like to welcome Ambassador Mohammed Dangor. Mohammed, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and jazakallah so much for joining us.
Shukran alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Let's look to Thursday. Obviously, the President gave his State of the Nation address. We were talking offline, we were talking so much offline about non-racism, non-sexism. How much does patriotism with us as South Africans resonate to what he said, and how far, how close are we as South Africans as a whole in allowing for that patriotism to run through?
I think the President was trying to rekindle the view of non-racism, non-sexism, non-tribalism, democracy, and the transformation of South Africa from a racist, oppressive state to a democratic state. In 1994, I think we thought we had achieved it. In fact, we did not achieve it. If I look today, I think at times that the society is a bit more divided than it was in 1994. In 1994, I think we were dealing with the issues of the first generation of people brought freedom. The second generation of people, our generation, brought democracy.
Yes.
And the third generation is going to have to bring development.
How do you allow that? I mean, it's difficult. I mean, as you look at the liberation movement, right? Obviously, there's this euphoria that happens within the 90s, and then you've got scandals like the arms deal scandal, and that in itself changes so much in terms of how people now look at the ruling party, how people now look at whether democracy can still function on a long term. And here we are in 2025, so much more has happened. So how does that occur with this current generation, which you're talking about, brings development? Because development is not just centered around South Africa developing itself. It also has to have foreign investment that comes in to allow for that development to happen.
I think 1994 happened, democracy happened, freedom happened. Are people less free today than they were in 1994? It's a question they need to ask themselves. But some people yearn for 1994 and want to go back to apartheid. There's no...
How do you change that mindset? Because it happens amongst our own Muslim people, saying, people will say, well, everything functioned during apartheid. But then there is the other side of the coin.
Let me explain to you. I was responsible, when I was in Parliament, for an area in Johannesburg called Region G. Stretches from Soweto through to Orange Farm. There are now 45 informal settlements there, with 1.5 million people. It's got a larger population than the Northern Cape Province. These are people that flocked in. Previously, people could not travel. They were not free to move. When people became free to move, they moved with their feet to where economic opportunities are. The three cities that are dealing with that kind of challenges is Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban, because that's where the economic opportunities, where the perceived economic opportunities are in the minds of people. So they moved there. So you've got 1.5 million people moving into Region G. There is no facilities. The facilities were not provided for. The facilities were not planned for. I don't call them informal settlements. I call them unplanned settlements because they were never planned. So the water would be a problem. The electricity would be a problem. And of course, people are stealing water and electricity because they don't have. What else do they do?
Sure.
Now, what the state has to do is we have to reimagine what happens in an area like Region G or the Cape Town area or the Durban area. we have to build new cities. We have to
But is there
reimagine.
money for that moment?
No. We have to find the money to build new cities. That will create an economy by itself. If, for example, we took and built a new city on the Vaal between Gauteng and the Free State, using the Vaal as a tourist attraction to come in, but also getting the steel industry back. And the question of metal moving out is a problem. We have to actually look at trade union ownership. A trade union companies taking ownership of such things. They are important assets of the state. And those assets should supply steel and rolling steel to the likes of the railways, to whatever else where steel is needed. But it's a South African asset. To have sold ISCO, which was a South African asset, to an Indian company who's looking at profit. And when they can't make the profit, they move their capital elsewhere. We need to look at the ownership thereof. And maybe, in my view, the ownership thereof should go into a trade union company, where the trade union actually has the controlling share of that particular company.
But can socialism and capitalism work? Look, if you had to ask ArcelorMittal, okay, so we'll give a stake to a trade union. The trade unions are generally of that of socialist mannerisms. It's just part and parcel of the way it is. It starts from the Russian Revolution. So that in itself presents a challenge. But does South Africa allow for that? They haven't given. But South Africa as a state is looking at foreign investment and allowing foreign investment to ride this wave of capitalism.
The question of capitalism, state capitalism, is an issue that needs to be discussed. It's not been fleshed out. But I think worker ownership would contribute to that kind of different kind of capital formation, because the workers would be actually benefiting directly from their own work, but ensuring that strategic assets remain in South Africa. At times I look at countries where the sanctions have been imposed. And it happened in the case of South Africa in the apartheid era, where sanctions were imposed. It actually developed local industry. And I think that the development of local industry is important. Foreign capital comes when there's profits, and where there's no profits to be made, they move off. So I think the ownership issues, I think we need to look at very carefully.
Mohammed, I want to touch on the Government of National Unity, a massive ideological change from the ANC's perspective to partner with what many term neoliberal parties like, for example, the Democratic Alliance, and then you enter into the frame the IFP, Freedom Front Plus. You've also got the Patriotic Alliance that have now been part of this Government of National Unity. Its functionality is something the citizens are going to keep a close eye on, but when you've got differences, and of course this is going to happen, the differences are going to happen in terms of the NHI bill, the Pella Act, and of course the land redistribution one. How does President Cyril Ramaphosa find that middle ground to enact bills which have been brought to Parliament long before the 7th administration began, and also satisfying the needs of his GNU partners?
I think what we need to encourage is patriotism across the board. And I think when President Cyril Ramaphosa initially called for a government of national unity, he also envisaged the EFF and the MK joining, along with all others.
Sure.
Now let's look at 1994 and the GNU of 1994.
Yes. And you would know well about it because you were there.
Yeah. The GNU of 1994 was envisaged to create a situation of stability, a situation of unity, a situation where nobody was going to go into the sea, a situation that also called for transformation. Because unless society is transformed, you're going to have a second social revolution, which may in fact be violent. And it could happen now as well. Unless people are willing to share, unless people are willing to transform, we'll have a second social revolution on our hands.
Sure.
And I think that is what we need to bear in mind. Now, there were color revolutions in Kiev. There were color revolutions in North Africa and the Middle East. And the color revolutions were called Maidan revolutions, was an Arabic word for square. They transferred that to Ukraine without even changing the name. So those people that want to effect a regime change do those kind of things. But I think as South Africans, where is our solution? Our solution is within South Africa. Our solution is within Africa. The African Free Trade Agreement provides that opportunity for us to build Africa. So if we build Africa, it doesn't matter what other people threaten us with. We will survive as Africa. But I think that is important that we need to build.
Before we go to the break, Mohammed, I want to touch on President Cyril Ramaphosa's handling of this diplomatic spat between Pretoria and Kigali. Of course, our troops lost their lives as part of the SADC and AU peacekeeping mission within the DRC. The situation remains volatile, and no one really knows how it ends up in the eastern part, especially in Goma. Have you been satisfied with the way President Ramaphosa has dealt with it in a way where Paul Kagame has really spewed some words which could even escalate this row?
You know, without having to want to escalate this issue myself, we need to look at Paul Kagame and his relationship with Israel.
Of course, yeah.
And ask yourself the question, where is that leading to?
Yeah.
However, part of our DNA is internationalism.
Yes.
And to protect and to promote human rights internationally. But our focal point is in fact Africa. And if we are committing troops, we should be committing troops to Africa for peacekeeping. Now, the troops over there, as a peacekeeping function, as part of the UN, as part of the SADC formations, and they were there as that. They were not there as a South African contingent on its own. Yeah. And that is why it was being misinterpreted, because people are trying to play politics with the lives of people. I mean, we must all send condolences to the families that have lost people. When people lose their lives, the families will suffer. The families will feel the pain. But if we are going to go into peacekeeping, then I think part of the risk is that people are going to get injured in the process. I think the solution is going to be a diplomatic one. That is going to be a peacekeeping one. And the leader of Angola is the head of trying to bring about that peaceful transformation there. And I think that is important, that it is led by a SADC leader, other than South Africa. Because South Africa is not the only player in the region to bring about peace in that particular region. But we must also look at what the role and objectives of Rwanda is in this instance. What was their role and objective in Cabo Delgado?
Yes.
Cabo Delgado is a northern province where, in fact, Frelimo was started.
Yes.
In Cabo Delgado. But wherever some oil companies go that I will not mention the name, you find a war.
Yeah.
You found them in Libya, you found them here, you found a war in Cabo Delgado. Again there, what does South Africa do? What does SADC do? We would have to go into a support the Mozambican people, not Frelimo as such. Because Cabo Delgado is oil and gas.
Yes.
And that is what some Western countries particularly want. So it is the control of, sometimes they give it political things, they give it religious issues, but the real fact is that it is the question of the curse of resources.
So definitely. Well, after the break, I'll continue my conversation with Ambassador Mohammed Dangor. We're going to be talking about community activism in the past and whether we could still bring it back in the present. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. This is a recording we're doing from our Cape Town studios. My name is Faraz Patel, and I'm still in conversation with Ambassador Mohammed Dangor, discussing a wide range of issues from domestic to foreign. Mohammed, let's touch on community activism. I mean, before we started this broadcast, you're telling me about how, as Muslims, going into different areas, raising awareness of activism, of course, against the apartheid government. When you look at it now from obviously a present day perspective, you're not fighting supposedly a regime, but you are fighting, of course, a lot of social ills that exist in society. As Muslims, why do you not see that supposed activism you saw pre-1994 as per now? And what do you attribute it to?
Prior to 1994, we were all members of various liberation organizations, of various civil society organizations. And in those civil society organizations, we were promoting, going back to the Doctor's Pact,
Sure.
of non-racism, non-sexism, democracy, and non-tribalism. It was that kind of message that we took forward. Now, we went then, some people went as the Transvaal Indian Congress, others of us went as the Call of Islam. And in the Call of Islam, led by Yusuf Saluji in Gauteng at that particular point in time, we had gone to every village and town to promote the issue of non-racism, non-sexism, democracy, non-tribalism, and the question of liberation.
Yes.
But the question was also one of inclusivity, that we're a part of a broader South African society who may have been Muslims by faith. By identity, we could have been many other things, but we were South Africans essentially.
Yes.
And as such, we were involved in all the structures of the liberation movements, whether it was the ANC, the PAC, or AZAP. We may not have had the same vision of what we were going to, but we all shared the question of liberation. So I think those other two organizations should not be forgotten. The role AZAPO played should not be forgotten.
Yes.
The role that the PAC played should not be forgotten. And the role of the ANC should not be forgotten. But people were members of the structures of those movements. They were not a Muslim component of the structure. That resulted in many people in 1994 asked, why was there so many Muslims in the cabinet? They were not there as Muslims. Why were there so many Muslims in the legislatures? They were not there as Muslims. They were there because they came from the liberation movements, from the people's struggles, and from the ground. I think it is important what we've lost now is that kind of activism for minority communities in that particular area. What has also resulted in the question of the perception of non-racism and tribalism particularly, was the question of exclusion. And the question of exclusion has given rise to organizations such as the Patriotic Alliance, which is frankly at times racist, and Al-Jama. The one is a sectarian response, the other one is a racist response. And these are the phenomena that, as the ANC, we would have to look at. We would have to look at how we've dealt with the language question. In the Northern Cape, the majority of the people speak Afrikaans. In the Western Cape, the majority of the people speak Afrikaans. We've made 12 official languages, but we've not promoted all of them. English has become the language of record by default, not by design.
Of course.
But the question of language is very close to the hearts of people. And as the ANC, we would have to address those issues, as we would have to address the perception of exclusion as the ANC, as we would have to look at the perception of people being left out in the process. Because that leaving out is actually what is creating the perceptions within the so-called minority communities, a term that I hate very much so. And I think what we need to do is look at ourselves inwardly as the ANC one, as the broad movement too as well, and three, as society.
Sure.
And how do we encourage young people, particularly, to get involved in the street struggles, in the home struggles, in the struggles of the economy, in the struggles of the trade union movement, in the struggles of the faith-based organizations to take forward this kind of society that we looked at. Strangely enough, I'm reminded that the faith-based organizations called a conference about the role of and the responsibilities of believers in a future society.
Yes.
And what came out of there went into the Constitution's Bill of Rights.
To that point, Mohammed, I want to talk on minority communities. Let's go to last year's elections, and especially when it comes to Muslims, because when I spoke to them, and a lot of their responses were, we don't want to vote because nothing's going to change. Now, that would seem on the onset a very ignorant mentality, but they feel that the government has not worked towards them in a favorable manner. Now, it's something they've developed, especially the new generation. How do you then take that very same mentality, flip it around, and tell them their actual role, their bigger role that they have in a democratic country?
You know, the issue of transformation, we realized right at the beginning, was not going to be easy. We looked at the resources that were within communities. And we looked at what resources could be developed within those communities as well. Now, unless people are involved on the ground, their representation is going to be minimized. Unless they're involved in the branches of whichever of those movements, the ANC, the PAC, or ZAPO, the others I don't consider as part of the liberation forces. Those three are the liberation motor forces. In any one of those, get involved. Get involved in SANCO, in the civic movement.
Yes.
Get involved in the Congress of Business and Economics. It is a progressive movement of the business community. Unless you're doing that, you are in fact not involved in the politics and the body of the country. You are not part of the, you have excluded yourself from the process now. Of course you can boycott, you know. There was a movement in the Western Cape in the early days that produced the best position papers, but never worked on the ground. So your philosophy can be exceptionally good, but unless you're working on the ground, there's nothing you're going to achieve. So the activism of the ground, we need to look at again. We need to go back to the doctor's pact. We need to look at the role of Dr. Dadu. And there's very little said in this era and time about the role of Dr. Dadu. We talk about Gandhi, we talk about all others, but Dadu was an important figure. And how much of Dr. Dadu are we experiencing today? Of bringing together the Doctor's Pact, about bringing back together the oppressed people, to in fact bring about the change that we in fact look at.
But here's the thing, Mohammed, if you speak to the younger people, they have this fatigue sense because they feel, well, it's not worth going to the streets and protesting. And I look at the youth, and a lot of the protesting are either coming from unions or more the elderly people. And when I mean elderly, I'm talking about 40 plus, where they would take to the streets to protest against service delivery or non-delivery from government. But of course, the 60s, 70s, and 80s was dominated by youth, even as young as 13 or 14 years old. I mean, I stand to be corrected. It was Zinzi Mandela or Zanele. I couldn't tell who of course, spoke at Orlando Stadium under the banner of the UDF when her father was about to release, the late Nelson Mandela. And I looked at her, and she was 13 or 14, and I said, there's a maturity that maybe we won't find in a lot of the youth today in terms of leading from the front in activism.
Zinzi speaking at Orlando Stadium is an important issue. Zinzi was speaking on behalf of the movement, which was banned. And that she expressed that her father would not come out of jail unless the conditions that he set out for the transformation of society are met. And that is the kind of activism that Zindi spoke about at that particular point in time.
Sure.
But the young people were there in June the 16th. But particularly so-called minority communities have had a lot of advantages. Now we need to look at the advantages or the advantage youth and the disadvantage youth within those very communities.
Yes, of course, yes.
And how do we actually rekindle? And the movement has to go back. All the movements have to go back and rekindle the spirit of what was then liberation to the spirit of transformation, to the spirit of development. Now, it is collective development then. Now, there was never, and there will never be enough resources to cover everything. The question of local government is a serious thing, because local government is still based upon the spatial divisions that were created by apartheid. There's no local government in my mind that can survive without national support financially, because it just isn't there.
Sure.
What we have not done and what we need to do is to actually develop the rural provinces, to develop their economies so that they don't need to feel that they need to move to the Joburgs, the Cape Towns or the Durbans. If those economies are developed, we will actually see a different change. But the youth need to become involved in that kind of development. Now, also they need to be involved in the Congress of Business Economics. They need to be part of the trade union movement. They need to be part of the civic organizations that are operating on the ground so that they can actually talk about service delivery and address the question of service delivery and where the resources for that service delivery is going to come from.
One final question before we go to the break. Leadership. You've seen it all. You've seen the worst of leadership in South Africa when it came to the National Party prime ministers. You've seen the best in Nelson Mandela, that euphoria. We then saw, of course, what many looked at as probably the most questionable leadership under the time of former President Jacob Zuma during a democratic era. And people look to President Ramaphosa to be that person to change all of that and bring back a sense of a leader leading from the front. Where is South Africa in terms of leadership? And I'm not just talking about the executive, I'm talking about political parties also, because, you know, just listening to Sona, everyone's got their thing to say. It's nothing that amazes anybody. Your assessment on leadership in the country?
Basically, we look at the era of Mandela and we see the era of liberation. We look at the era of Mbeki and we saw the biggest growth in the country during that particular area, because there was a cohesive cabinet and there was and the nation was patriotic enough to move forward in there. The question of Jacob Zuma, and God bless his soul, what he's doing now is actually encouraging a form of Zulu nationalism, of Zulu Asabia. And Zulu nationalism, the reason I think that provinces were created was to prevent a kingdom of KwaZulu-Natal emerging and a Western Cape Republic. We didn't actually resolve that particular matters. In fact, we thought we resolved them by creating provinces. What we're actually sitting with now is those two areas that we actually need to deal with. The question of embedded tribalism and the language question in the other provinces now. If we're talking about those kind of issues, that kind of leadership is not going to take us forward. That kind of leadership is in fact going to lead us to a kind of Libya. What we need to do is get a cohesive leadership that is patriotic, that will take the country forward. Now, the Afrikaner community of old may have been racist, but they were patriots.
Patriots, yes, of course,
They didn't owe their allegiance to the Americans or to the Israelis. The new opposition wherein we have to encourage them to change, actually owe their responses to other countries.
Yes.
And that is not patriotic. So we have to encourage them to change in that. And it's up to all of us. It's a collective leadership. It is not a solo leadership.
Sure.
And when Paul became deputy president, some of us said to him, you know, Paul, what we don't need is another philosopher king quoting poetry in parliament. We need a fixer.
Yes.
So what you need to do now is let Cyril become the philosopher king. Let him take forward the vision, but you become the fixer.
Yes.
And I think that is the important role that we need to look at now.
After the break, we shift our focus from domestic to foreign. And of course, for those of you who don't know, Ambassador Mohammed Dangor served as a representative of the country in various Middle Eastern nations. And that is where the focus will go to. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. We are now shifting from South Africa and heading straight into the Middle East. And I'm joined by Ambassador Mohammed Dangor, who of course served as an ambassador and special envoy to various countries across the Middle East, but least not in Syria. And of course, we saw what happened 2 months ago when the Assad regime was overthrown. Mohammed, when you saw it, of course, I remember calling you during that time when you were in Doha, Qatar. It was the Doha Forum, and of course, I remember watching on Al Jazeera, and you've got all of these questions that are being asked, and I remember having Iran, who of course, and Russia, who of course, huge backers to the Assad regime, and it felt uncomfortable at that time for them, of course, seeing what had unfolded at that time. Did you expect something like this to happen, and not just happen in a way that normal revolutions occur, but the rapid pace at which it occurred?
Well, I was sitting in Doha and I asked myself a question as to what was happening. The foreign minister of Russia was there, the foreign minister of Iran was there, the foreign minister of Turkey was there. And in my analysis, and this is my analysis, it's not their views, let me be clear. In my analysis is that the Iranians and the Russians had decided that they could not afford this kind of war in Syria any longer. And had told Bashar to, in fact, to negotiate with the opposition and all other factions. And I think the Russians and the Iranians had sent the message out, and that's why the army didn't come out. There was no civil war. The army did not come out. They stayed in their barracks. Which is a good thing because it gives the new guys the opportunity to actually look forward with a positive view. Now the question is, what do we do? A, as South Africa, and B, as the international community. My view is we have to support whatever state comes into Syria at this particular point in time. And speaking to some people in Doha, they said, you know, the South African experience is important for the Syrians. To talk about an inclusive society, a society where nobody is excluded, to ensure that a cohesive Syria remains. And they said to me, it's not important for a state delegation to come. It's not important even for the non-aligned movement, which I'm a member of, to come, or the anti-apartheid movement to come. It is important to relate the interfaith activity prior to South Africa's liberation and what they had in fact done. How they had encouraged an inclusive society, and that needs to be shared with the Lebanese and with the Syrians to ensure that there's no Kurdistan that's going to break away where the oil is and where the Americans are.
Sure.
With the Druze up to the Golan Heights, where the water is. So it's again the question of resources. To ensure that Syria belongs together. But interestingly enough, when Zola Skawia, former minister, and myself and Aziz Bahan visited, we visited every country from Casablanca to Baghdad.
Sure.
We saw the kings, we saw the amirs, we saw the
Prime
foreign
ministers.
ministers, we saw the prime ministers, we saw the presidents. In Israel, we saw the director general for 20 minutes. And his answer was, we want to expand, support our expansion. The question of peace was not on their mind. And Zola said, it doesn't matter how many times we are rebutted, how many times they treat us badly. We are believers in peace, and we'll share the message of peace with them again and again and again to educate them.
But to what extent, Ambassador? A moment, because here's my thing. Everyone knows what the animal that they're dealing with, which is Israel. It's clear. I mean, and we're going to touch on that a bit in the next segment with Donald Trump. You look at the body language of Netanyahu. This man has no interest in peace. Nothing.
But
So how do you talk? I mean, to what extent are you going to bang your head up until you are bleeding?
what we need to do is get the collective of societies in the world to act as they did with South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement.
But the US and the European Union are those ones. They're the only ones who can bring about
Yeah.
sanctions.
But I'm not talking about state level. What happened in South Africa's case, the trade unions refused to offload the ships. The businesses refused to do business any longer. The faith-based organizations, of course, still kept in touch because they needed to influence those faith-based organizations without excluding them. But the message was quite clear that they were bringing apart. Now, as for the global anti-apartheid movement, to take this issue on now, and not only leave it to the states. If we talk to the trade unions in Holland, yes, they could come up with a similar thing. If, it's happened in Bolivia, where the trade union movement refused to do things. It will happen in Latin America, where they would do that.
Sure.
Now, we launched on 29th of May last year. We didn't launch. We had gathered together people from North America, from Latin America, from Europe, from South Asia, and from Africa to rekindle the anti-apartheid movement globally, to look at all the anti-apartheid issues, not only Palestine,
Sure.
but with this particular point in time, to focus on Palestine. We launched the South African chapter last month. And in the South African chapter, of course, we are going to move forward to the African chapter. But our disadvantage is when we were fighting for freedom, and we had the frontline state support. We need to encourage the frontline states to the Palestinians to start taking a different line.
Sure.
The two frontline states that did support was Syria and Lebanon. I don't know with the changes now, what their situation is. And of course, Algeria. How do we encourage those frontline states that under the thumb of foreign powers to actually take a role to bring about, and I'm talking about a peaceful struggle here. And the non-aligned movement and the anti-apartheid movement is a peaceful struggle to bring about change. I mean, if people want militant struggles, it is their struggle.
Of
It
course.
must be Palestinian-led. It must be Palestinian-determined. We shouldn't determine for the Palestinians what they should be doing. But we should be encouraging them to unite. And one of the things we can do is to bring all those factions back here again and get them to a position that we had with the Harare Declaration, where we brought the liberation movements together. We brought Africa together to say don't collaborate, and we brought the frontline states together. This was the success of Oliver Tambo with the Harare Declaration.
Moment before we go to the break, I just want to come back to Syria. Obviously, there's still negotiations in terms of a full out-and-out government. The biggest question is that you've got the United States of America. If it's not the government, it's of course the conglomerate interest, whether it's oil, gas, finance. They're keeping a close eye on this. How does whoever is going to be the new Syrian leadership stave off away this potential Western interest, and the Western interest that only wants one thing and one thing only, and that's pure capitalism? But a Syria that now works for its own people, a supposed populace that has gone through so much over this last few decades.
Syria, in my experience, and there was a sheikh called Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, who stood on the mimbar once, and I listened to him very carefully. He said, in Syria, we don't only tolerate one another. We recognize each other's right to be different.
Sure.
It's a very profoundly different position to tolerance. But this was the experience of the Syrian society. They didn't see the difference between Shia and Sunni, between Maronite and Orthodox,
Sure.
between Muslim and Christian, or between non-believers. There were lots of communists there as well,
Yes.
and they didn't see those differences. They worked together at that particular point in time as Syrians. I think to capitalize upon that particular point would be very good. A, for the neighbors, and B, for whatever international community that wants to participate there, whether they accept it or not. They would have to be invited, of course, to do that. And I think we could approach both the Lebanese and the Syrians.
Sure.
And they said to me, importantly, don't bring a state delegation. Don't bring a movement delegation. Don't bring an interfaith delegation to share that.
Sure. After the break, I wrap up the conversation with Ambassador Mohammed Dangor, and we're going to continue talking on Palestine, but of course, comments that were made this week by Donald Trump, the US president, in terms of shifting the residents of Gaza away from their very same homeland. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. We are in the final parts of this conversation with Ambassador Mohammed Dangor. Mohammed, I want to speak on comments that were made by US President Donald Trump on the supposed plan of relocation to various neighboring countries, Jordan and Egypt being two of them. And of course, both their respective governments said straight, no, this will not happen. You've got a populace that has gone through a deadly genocide, and yet we've got a president in Trump with what seems, if not glaringly obvious, right-wing supposed extremist comments. The way the US is operating right now, how do you see this? And surely this sings to exactly the tune that Israel wants in terms of the ethnic cleansing of many Palestinians.
I think the reason for the war initially was to actually obtain this kind of objective. They knew that Donald Trump was going to be elected, but also know that Donald Trump is transactional. It's a deal, and what can he get out of the deal?
He's a capitalist by nature.
Yeah. And there's an old saying that when a bee robs the flower of its nectar, it is also responsible for its pollination.
Sure.
We all talk about a two-state solution, but maybe this is creating the conditions for one non-racial democratic state in the entire area. Whether you be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Arab, non-Arab, living in Bilad al-Sham. To bring about a sense that this kind of action is going to change the minds of people. Instead of now demanding a two-state solution divided in an awkward way that could not work, like the homelands, maybe this is the opportunity. If I was a Palestinian, and I'm not, and I should be led by the Palestinians and not try and lead them, into saying it is the opportunity now to campaign for a one-state, democratic, non-racial, non-sectarian in the entire region. I was with Zola Skawia and Aziz Pahad. We visited, as I said,
The DG of Israel, yes.
yeah, the DG of Israel. But the question that Zola Skawia had put to Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was, you know, we took a position that South Africa belongs to all of us, all who live in it. And Hassan Nasrallah's response was that Bilad al-Sham should belong to all who live in it. That means Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan.
But it can't happen with Zionism,
Yeah, no.
Mohammed. I mean, sorry, I know I'm interrupting you there because you listen to Theodore Herzl, you listen to Ben Gurion,
Yeah.
you listen to Golda Meir, right? You listen to Netanyahu, you listen to Ariel Sharon. They don't want to live with Palestinians.
Yeah.
They want to have this ethnic Zionist state for themselves exclusively.
Now, instead of saying we want a separate Palestinian state, if the Palestinians are arguing, it creates the opportunity what Donald Trump is talking about, to say we are all belonging here. That the right of return is those sitting in Lebanon, come home. Those sitting in Syria, come home. Those millions sitting throughout the world, come home. To have a non-racial society now. What Donald Trump needs to answer to, does he accept a non-racial society, or does he want an exclusively ethno-religious state in an area? And I think what the Europeans would have to answer to is, would they support such a position? What the Africans would have to do similarly. So I think if I was a Palestinian, and that's not their position,
Yes.
they still talk about the two-state solution. If I was a Palestinian, I would be fighting for one democratic state in the entire region.
Yeah, but I mean, you talk of what if the Palestinians want a two-state solution, that is the talk of Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
I mean, I listen to him. He still believes he can find a way.
Yeah.
But when you look at the Hamas political bureau, and of course they've lost two great leaders in Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh, they said straight, we can't see, even if we negotiate with Israel, we cannot find a way to convince them to want to live side by side because they've made up their minds. And that sings exactly to what Donald Trump wants.
Did the Afrikaners not have the same position in South Africa?
Of course they did, yes.
Did the world and the South African population not change and force them to change their mind? What is so difficult? I know it is difficult. It's impossible almost. But the attempt should be made to change the minds. And the mind change is not going to be in Tel Aviv. It's going to be in London.
Yes.
It's going to be in New York. So we have to use the instruments that changes the minds in London, Berlin, and New York to change, to bring about a change in the region.
Sure.
But also, the regional leaders have to would have to accept that now.
But that's why Palestinians say our leaders across that region have failed us tremendously. Instead, they want to sign this so-called Abrahamic Accord, which was started by Donald Trump in his first term.
Yeah. The Abrahamic Accords is a separate issue. I'll come to. It's a very interesting issue.
Sure.
But I think what I'm saying is, and I've lived there in the region. I've walked the region. I've walked in Israel. I've walked in Palestine. There is no room for two states.
Of course.
They've gobbled it all up. They've eaten it all up. Is to fight for a democratic state that the Europeans would have to reject against, and they would have to tell their population why they're supporting apartheid. And the Americans would have to support, to accept, including the Black American caucus, to say we're now supporting an apartheid state.
Yes.
So the question is really to challenge those societies to start changing their minds and their view towards this issue. Because if Trump did not bring this about, I would not be thinking this way. So I'm saying that when a bee robs a flower of its nectar, it is responsible for its pollination. There are leaders of Hamas like Khalid Mishal sitting there. And there are other leaders that we can engage with to take such a position forward. But they must lead.
Yes.
And what we need to do as South Africa is to bring the Palestinian motor forces together in South Africa to create a kind of a Harare declaration.
Sure.
So that they can have they don't have to love each other. They have a short-term objective of bringing about liberation.
Let's touch on Abrahamic Accords. You want to talk on that. When you speak to Palestinians, there's disappointment. One of the first countries to sign it was Egypt under Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Egyptians straight out, when you speak to many of its populace right now, they don't agree with him. A lot of what he's doing. When you look at countries like Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, the Palestinians continually say they feel failed by what has happened with their neighbors. This Abrahamic Accords, of course, it's missing one final pending approval, and that is Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. But what does that tell? That if this whole Abrahamic Accords is signed, surely then the Palestinian people would even feel more betrayed by what is currently occurring.
I read an article written by a journalist in the Middle East that suggests that the Abrahamic Accords, in fact, is to separate Egypt and North Africa from the Gulf. That the children of Abraham are the Gulf and Israel.
Sure.
That excludes Iran, excludes Pakistan,
Yes,
excludes Indonesia. So the Abrahamic Accords will then bring together, on a tribal and racial basis, the people living in the Gulf and Israel,
Yes.
excluding the Egyptians, excluding the Turks, excluding... And that is the danger of the Abrahamic Accords, that it seeks to provide that kind of divisions. So I think what we need to look at is not what the Abrahamic Accords can achieve, but in spite of what the Abrahamic Accords are saying, is how do we motivate, not we, how do the Palestinians motivate the people in the Gulf to take a different position? Now, as difference between the population and the states.
Yes.
The states are under pressure. The state leaders are under pressure. How do you persuade them to follow their populations in this particular direction?
Okay, I got about 30 to 40 seconds, Mohammed. President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa will not be bullied. He went straight out in saying that he will not cave into the pressure by Donald Trump with regards to the Land Expropriation Act that had been signed. Is that a leader standing up saying, no, Washington, we will not cave in to what you are saying? I'm giving you 30 to 40 seconds.
Well, I think what Cyril has done is stood on principle. The methodology of how we explain things is different. Ibrahim Rasool's job is cut out for him.
Sure.
He's got to really explain what this Land Expropriation Act is. Now, basically, it's the following. One is it's for public use. It's not, I can take your land away.
Yes.
And if it's for public use, it's to build a bridge, it's to build a railway line, it's to build a school.
State resources, yes.
State, no, for the public good.
For the public good, yes,
For the
of course.
public good. Now, if that is the reason, there is no expropriation without compensation that's going to happen without a process.
Of course.
And the process is going to be arbitration and the courts to decide upon whether we can expropriate for the sake of the state, whatever land there is. And nobody's land is going to be taken away in the legal way. And that is the misunderstanding. And this is why I'm appealing to South Africans to be patriots. In this instance, as in the question with the killings in Rwanda, to be patriots and to stand as one nation.
Ambassador Mohammed Dangor, such a pleasure having this conversation with you. Really appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That's Ambassador Mohammed Dangor joining me here on News in Focus from our Cape Town studio. That's all we have for you here from myself, Faraz Patel. I generally would say the Joburg team, but this time I'm going to say the entire Cape Town team. I'll see you again same time, same place tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.